The Pokemon TCG is going through some huge changes this spring, with Temporal Forces being released on March 22nd and the standard format rotating out all E-Block cards on April 4th. Luckily, Japan is already playing in this format with the new cards and the rotation, so we can take a look at what's doing well over there. For today's video, we'll be using Pokekameshi.com's tier list, which has compiled the City League results, and it shows us how well the decks are performing at City League tournaments over in Japan. Starting with the decks they have listed in tier 4, we're going to kick things off with Giratina Lost Zone. So Giratina Lost Zone has been consistently one of the best decks in our current standard format before rotation and before the new set. Giratina is losing a couple of important cards, including Path to the Peak and Battle VIP Pass, but the rest of the decks in the format are also losing these cards. Battle VIP Pass is probably less of a big deal than Path to the Peak is for this deck, because Giratina's strategy heavily relied around disrupting the opponent in the late game to stage a comeback, and that's going to look a little different now with Path to the Peak gone. This is a first place deck list from a City League, and this deck list chose to use the new Maximum Belt as the A spec. Maximum Belt says that attacks used by the Pokemon this card is attached to do 50 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon EX. So that's going to bring up Giratina's Lost Impact attack all the way to 330 damage when it's swinging into an EX Pokemon. So it's going to be able to one-shot something like a Charizard EX with Lost Impact, and then maybe one-shot a different Charizard EX with Star Requiem all in the same game. I think we'll also see Giratina decks play Prime Catcher, which is another A-spec that says switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon into the active, and then you switch one of your bench Pokemon into the active. Essentially, it's Guzma on an item card, but these are A-specs, so you can only play one of them, just like Radiant Pokemon. So here we see that this deck list chose to play Maximum Belt. We'll have to see what the popular choice is, though, for this archetype as more tournaments happen. We also have Emergency Board in this deck, which says the retreat cost of the Pokemon this card is attached to is 1 less, and if the Pokemon has 30 HP or less remaining, it has no retreat cost instead. This is just going to be a really nice tool for Comfey decks, so you can slap that on your Comfey, and then it has free retreat as long as that tool stays on the Pokemon. So that's going to be really helpful for Lost Zone decks. And then lastly, we have the Buddy Poffin card, which is kind of a replacement for Battle VIP Pass. It allows you to search your deck for up to 2 basic Pokemon with 70 HP or less and put them onto your bench. So the obvious issue here is that the only Pokemon it can search for in this deck is Comfey. Nothing else. It can't even search for Sableye. So it's very far off from a one-to-one replacement for Battle VIP Pass, but it's going to do some of the same things for this deck. Next, we have a first place Raging Bolt EX Sandy Shock EX deck. So Sandy Shock was already released in Paradox Rift. It has the ability Magnetic Absorption. Once during your turn, if your opponent has 4 or fewer prize cards remaining, you may attach a basic fighting energy card from your discard pile to this Pokemon. Note that this is not restricted to just once per turn overall. So if you have 2 or 3 Sandy Shocks EXs on the board and you meet the requirements of your opponent having 4 or fewer prize cards remaining, you'll be able to activate all of the Magnetic Absorption abilities. This is important because the main attacker of this deck is Raging Bolt EX, which is a really bulky Dragon-type Pokemon with no weakness. So keep in mind, with the Ancient Booster Energy Capsule attached, this thing will have 300 HP and no weakness, which is really incredible stats. And then the main attack of this Pokemon, and for the whole deck actually, is going to be Climactic Descent, which costs a lightning and a fighting energy, and then it does 70 times the amount of basic energy you discard from your Pokemon. So if you use a Sandy Shocks to accelerate an energy, and then you attach for turn, and then you use Professor Sada's Vitality to attach 2 more energy, that'll be a total of 4 energy on the board, which means the Climactic Descent would be capping at 280 that turn. Of course, if you have more than 1 Sandy Shock, then that can go up to 350. If you already have energy saved from previous turns, it can go higher, easier as well. So this is obviously a newer archetype, which is going to be less solved than some of the other decks we'll talk about today. utilizing this new Raging Bolt EX, and also that single prizer Koraidon, which we'll talk about more when we get to the Ancient Box decks. The other new card in this deck is Prime Catcher, being chosen as the ace spec here. I think Prime Catcher is kind of just like the default choice. If the deck doesn't have a specific need for one of the other ace specs, Prime Catcher is just like the most generally powerful. And it's also really good for this deck because this deck is not going to be wanting to play a supporter that's not Professor Sada's most of the time. So this helps you be able to gust while also playing Professor Sada's on that turn. Next in tier 4 is a first place Roaring Moon EX deck, but this is also really going heavy into the single prize Roaring Moon as well as the new Flutter Mane. Of course, we know Roaring Moon EX has 230 HP, it has the Frenzied Gouging attack that can instantly knock out anything, and then it also has Calamity Storm, which can do as much as 220 damage. I think a combination of the new Mist energy that's coming out in this set, which prevents effects of attacks, which will prevent Frenzied Gouging if your opponent's active Pokemon has Mist energy on it, and also the fact that we have a lot of VMAX Pokemon rotating out of the format, so there's less 3-prize Pokemon around, which makes Frenzied Gouging just a little less impressive. Roaring Moon EX probably won't be as strong as a lead Pokemon as it has been in our current standard format. Also to note is that Galarian Moltres V is rotating out, so we will no longer have that option of Dire Flame Wings into Energy Switch and using a heavier Professor's Research engine. This deck is going to rely more on Professor Sada's Vitality than we're seeing current Roaring Moon deck lists. Enough about the old Roaring Moon though, let's talk about the new single prizer Roaring Moon that has Vengeful Feathers. For 2 dark energy, it does 70 damage plus 10 more damage for each ancient card in your discard pile. This can very quickly rack up a lot of damage because we're playing 9 ancient Pokemon, and then we're playing 4 Professor Sada's, 4 of the other new ancient supporter card, 4 Earthen Vessel, 3 ancient booster energy capsule. So we're playing a good bit of ancient cards, also the new ace spec. So this isn't going to be built around just using that Vengeful Feathers attack from the new Roaring Moon, but it will be a nice supplemental single prize attacker that can easily answer other single prize attackers and maybe even knock out some weaker 2-prize Pokemon or things with dark weakness. And then of course also in this deck, not as kind of a main part of the deck, but definitely here to help, is Flutter Mane, which we'll see more of in the Ancient Box decks. Flutter Mane is an ancient Pokemon with the ability Witching Hour Flutter. I believe that has a different translation, but this is just the proxies we're using from justinbasil.com. Also, shouts out justinbasil.com for these proxies. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, your opponent's active Pokemon has no abilities. So this is going to be incredible against something like a Lost Zone engine deck that's using Comfey. It also has a pretty decent attack, Flying Curse, for 3 colorless, which you can easily get some energy on with Professor Sada's and manual attachments. It does 90 damage and then put 2 damage counters on your opponent's bench Pokemon in any way you like. So maybe you know that your opponent has a Pokemon like Raging Bolt on the bench that has 240 damage, and your Roaring Moon EX caps out at 220 with Calamity Storm, so you could put 2 damage counters on one of those Pokemon to soften it up for Roaring Moon EX later on. As I mentioned, this deck is also playing Explorer's Guidance, which is another ancient card. It's a supporter that's essentially like the old supporter Hapu, except it has the ancient emblem on it. Look at the top 6 cards of your deck and put 2 of them into your hand. Discard the other cards. This card's pretty good. It's going to be really good in decks where you want things in the discard pile. Obviously, you're keeping 2 out of 6 cards, so you are discarding 4. When you compare this to something like Colress's Experiment, where you look at 5 and you keep 3, it might seem worse card advantage wise, but if you don't want to Lost Zone things, and if you specifically want more cards in your discard pile for cards like Dark Patch and Professor Sada's Vitality and the new Roaring Moon's Vengeful Feathers attacks, then this Explorer's Guidance card quickly becomes advantageous for you to discard these cards. This is also playing a new A-Spec Awakening Drum, which is our ancient A-Spec in this set, and it simply says draw a card for each of your ancient Pokemon in play. So this is what Roaring Moon EX is currently looking like. At least this is a first place deck list from a recent City League. And for our last tier 4 deck from this Pokekameshi.com tier list, we have Lost Zone Box with Paradox Pokemon. The new cards in this top 4 deck list from a recent City League include the new Emergency Board to give your Comphase easier time retreating, as well as Prime Catcher as the A-Spec of choice. Not completely new from Temporal Forces, but new from Paldean Fates is the Crisis Punch technical machine, which can be attached to Cramorant and used for free because of Cramorant's Lost Provisions ability. Of course, you can only use it when your opponent is at exactly 1 prize card, but doing 280 damage for free can pretty easily close up a game if your opponent has a double prize Pokemon in the active position. Before we get into the tier 3 decks, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more Pokemon TCG content, and check out all of my sponsors and affiliates in the description down below if you'd like to support my channel, and also save yourself some money on things that you're already going to buy, like pre-orders for new products at PokeCollect.com and Pokemon TCG Live code cards at PoTownStore.com. Also, if you have a ton of Pokemon cards lying around that you don't need anymore, TCGBulk.com is the quickest, easiest, and safest way to get money for your bulk cards that you no longer need. Check out that and the rest of the links in the description down below. Thank you for supporting my channel, and now let's get into the tier 3 decks from this Pokekameshi tier list. We'll start with Lugia V-Star Archeops. Why is this deck back? Well, there could be a couple of reasons. Reason number 1, I think, is just because it's a kind of strong, tanky, simple deck, and it's probably taking advantage of these newer archetypes that are trying to find their footing, while this Lugia deck can just set up and truck through some Pokemon. It also, though, gets the new energy card that I mentioned, Mist Energy, as well as a new Cinccino. That Mist Energy is going to prevent all effects of attacks done to the Pokemon it's attached to, so it's going to save your Pokemon from things like Star Requiem and Roaring Moon's Frenzied Gouging. But this new Cinccino is the attacker that these decks are focusing around, especially in this first place Lugia list from a City League. We have this new Cinccino with the special roll attack. It does 70 damage for each special energy card attached to this Pokemon. Now, it does note that it has to be a card and not special energies, so something like Reversal Energy, I believe, would only count as 1 energy for this attack. But with Primal Turbo from Archeops, you can very easily attach 4 special energies to this Pokemon and then swing for 280 damage from a single prizer. So it honestly does seem pretty strong, but I am skeptical of Lugia being one of the best decks in the new format. The other new card this deck is using is the new Hero's Cape A-Spec. The Pokemon this card is attached to gets plus 100 HP. So that's actually going to be a massive tool to deal with if you're not playing Lost Vacuum in your deck. So I think this card alone, if we're seeing it played a lot, will probably influence Lost Vacuum into a lot of decks that it wasn't already into, because plus 100 HP is crazy to have to deal with. Next, we have a first place Great Tusk Mill deck list. So there's a new single prize Great Tusk in this set. There's actually 2, but the one we're looking at has the attack Ground Collapse. Discard the top card of your opponent's deck, and then if you played an Ancient Supporter card from your hand during this turn, discard 3 more cards from your opponent's deck. So you get to discard 4 cards a turn with this Ground Collapse, as long as you played an Ancient Supporter card this turn. We already have Professor Sada's, which doesn't really synergize with this new Great Tusk, but it can help you set up multiple Great Tusks at a time so you have a flow of attackers. And then we also have the new Explorer's Guidance, which is going to be our other supporter card, so definitely playing 4 and 4 of these supporters in the deck. Explorer's Guidance looks at the top 6 cards of your deck, put 2 of them into your hand, discard the other cards. So that's going to activate the extra effect of Great Tusk's attack, so you make sure that you are milling 4 cards a turn. And then we actually have another control or stall or mill kind of support card in this set, Hand Trimmer. Each player discards until they have 5 cards in their hand. So if your opponent is just trying to hold a very large hand of cards and then Iono them back into the deck or judge them back into the deck so they don't deck out, Hand Trimmer is going to stop that from happening. And I feel like this could really be a pretty rough item to see your opponent play, depending on how many cards are in your hand and what you can reasonably get rid of. This deck is also choosing Hero's Cape as its ace spec to make Great Tusk a little tankier, but you also have 4 Ancient Booster Energy Capsules to bring Great Tusk up to 200, or with the Hero's Cape, 240 health. Next we have Gholdengo EX Palkia, and this is still being built pretty similar to the older lists. It's playing Canceling Cologne, it has Counter Catcher, Boss's Orders, and also Prime Catcher, so 3 different gust effects to try to pair with that Canceling Cologne to shut off your opponent's mana fee so you can use Moonlight Shuriken. And it's using a handful of new cards, not only that Prime Catcher as the ace spec, but also 3 Buddy Poffins. And it's playing the new Full Metal Lab Stadium, which says all metal Pokemon take 30 less damage from attacks from your opponent's Pokemon. So that's pretty good to help Gholdengo be a little bit beefier at 290 HP effectively for a one-shot knockout. It also is playing 2 new supporter cards, the first being Morty's Conviction, which you have to discard a card from your hand and then you draw a card for each of your opponent's benched Pokemon. So that could really help you get some pretty large hands with a lot of options. And also a supporter card I'm really excited about, which is Cryptomaniac's Deciphering. It's essentially a reprint of the supporter card Mallow, saying search your deck for 2 cards and then put them on top of your deck. This card is insane with Gholdengo EX because Gholdengo EX is already drawing you just 2 cards for free with its ability. So you can search for any 2 cards you need with Cryptomaniac and then just draw them with Gholdengo or draw them with Radiant Greninja, or even if they're items, draw them essentially with Pokestop. So I think Cryptomaniac's Deciphering is a massive new inclusion for the Gholdengo EX archetype. And last in the tier 3 decks, we have an Ancient Box deck list that placed 2nd at a City League. This is going to be focusing on the new Koraidon, the new Roaring Moon, and the new Fluttermane. We haven't looked over this new Koraidon yet, though, in this video. The Koraidon has 140 HP, so as always, note that this can use Ancient Booster Energy Capsule to go all the way up to 200 health. And its main attack is the Primeval Battering. It does 30 damage for each of your ancient Pokemon in play. So if you have a full board of ancient Pokemon, 1 in the active, 5 on the bench, this will be doing 180 damage for just 2 energy on a single prizer, and potentially 180 damage for 2 energy on a 200 HP single prizer if you have the Ancient Booster Energy Capsule attached. So using the Koraidon's Primeval Battering in the early game for maximum damage, maybe using Fluttermane if you're against a Lost Zone deck so you can keep their Comp Phase locked while doing a little bit of damage. And then in the late game, you have Roaring Moon with Vengeful Feathers that can do a whole ton of damage because of all of the ancient cards that are in this deck. Getting into our top 3 archetypes from this tier list, we have Arceus Giratina. This is a first place deck list, and it's using the new Iron Leaves. The new Iron Leaves is actually a massive reasoning to why Arceus Giratina is seeing a lot of play. It's also just good because Arceus Giratina is an established archetype that we know how to build, we know how to make it function. It did lose Path of the Peak, but it looks like players are replacing that with Pokemon League Headquarters to make it harder for basic Pokemon to attack. The Iron Leaves EX card, 220 HP grass type with the Future emblem, has the ability Rapid Vernier. Once during your turn, when you play this card onto your bench, you can switch it into the active and then move any number of energy from your other Pokemon to Iron Leaves, and then it does the Prismatic Edge attack for 180. This card might not seem that impressive other than being able to switch itself and move energy, but it hits for weakness against Charizard EX, and Charizard EX is at the very top of this tier list. It's the most popular, most successful deck right now at Japanese City League events, so having a card that can just be put onto the bench, come into the active, fully powered up out of nowhere, and then one shot of Charizard EX is going to be a really, really valuable thing to have in your deck. And that's a really large reason why Arceus Giratina is seeing a lot of success right now. Also, like I said, it's just a consistent deck. And I think another big thing here to note is the maximum belt is a huge addition for this deck. Doing plus 50 damage to an EX Pokemon means that Arceus's Trinity Nova can knock out basic EX Pokemon. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, it means Giratina's Lost Impact can do 330 damage to an EX Pokemon. Next, we have Temporal. Kind of surprised to see that our top 3 decks from Japan right now are Arceus, Temporal, and of course we'll get to Charizard in just a moment. Temporal using the new Prime Catcher as its A-spec of choice, also using Cryptomaniac's Deciphering and Buddy Poffin. Like I said, Cryptomaniac's Deciphering is just incredible in a deck where you have things like Radiant Greninja and Pokestop and Bibarel, because you could just put the cards on top and get them. So it's like search for 2 cards essentially. Really, really like this new supporter card. Temporal, I'm not sure that it'll actually stay at the top of the meta, but if the meta is Charizard heavy, Temporal typically has a really good time against Charizard, so it would make sense that we're also seeing success from Temporal, and this was a first place deck list from the City League. Lastly, we have Charizard EX, and we're actually seeing an uptick of the Bibarel variant from Japan. Now, it's still early days. They just got these cards a couple of weeks ago. They just started playing these events, and these are City Leagues, kind of the comparison to North American's League Cups. So this is nowhere near the end-all be-all as to what will be the best. There are plenty of Charizard Pidgeot decks also being played, but according to the data from Japanese resources, Charizard Bibarel is seeing the most success right now. As for new cards in the deck, we have the Prime Catcher as the A-spec of choice, we have 4 Buddy Poffins to replace the VIP passes, and we have 1 of the Cryptomaniac's Deciphering because we're playing Bibarel, so why not? It almost turns Bibarel into a double Pidgeot EX if you really think about it like that. And those are the top decks in the Japanese format right now. Let me know down below what you think about these decks, and what about other decks that are missing, like Future Box, or any other pre-existing archetypes that you'd like to see updates for. I'll be covering plenty of decks and deck lists and meta of the Temporal Forces format on this channel, so make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time here on Celio's Network.